All right, good morning. It's a minute after 9, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Jason Ryan, Chair of the Task Force. Thank you all for being here today. This is the fourth and final workshop of the week. I appreciate everybody's hard work this week going into next week, where we have a lot of work in front of us as well. Today we have one presentation by ERCOT. We should have plenty of time to get through that and ask questions before we wrap up our work for the day and the week. Before we get started, I'll give you my typical reminder that our charter contains the following provision. The Commission strictly prohibits members of the task force and their employees and other entities or persons that may participate in task force activities from using their participation in the task force activities as a forum for engaging in practices or communications that violate applicable antitrust laws. As a result, the task force representatives and their member organizations are committed to full compliance with federal and state antitrust laws and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we conduct our activities. Thank you for those joining on Teams. If you can just remember to mute yourself if you're not speaking. There's also a chat feature where you can ask questions, and we'll try to keep an eye on that. We will be posting the materials that are presented today in the PUC project 53911, along with a recording of this meeting. There will also be contact information for who you can contact regarding questions about today's presentation. So if we don't get to your questions during today's hour, feel free to email that contact person and follow up with your questions. So with that, I will turn it over to ERCOT for the presentation.
This is Nitika Mago. I can share my screen. I am on Teams. Before I start, just to confirm, you are able to hear me.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So give me just a minute to get this going. Okay. Once more again, to confirm, you are able to see my screen share.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Absolutely. So I have a good morning, everyone. This is Nitika Mago. I am from ERCOT Operations. Today, what I wanted to do is give you a very a high-level overview or introduction to ERCOT's ancillary service suite. I've got a few set of slides. I'm really hoping to just have a good discussion with everybody. So along the way, if there are questions, feel free to stop me, ask them. Myself or the other ERCOT representatives can try to help address those as we go. So really, I was just hoping to use this slide deck to guide the discussion for the next hour. And okay, with that said, let's just get quickly into the subject matter. Most of you may be familiar. ERCOT has, ancillary services are something ERCOT procures to ensure sufficient resource capacities online or able to be brought online to balance the variability that our energy market cannot cover. Currently, we have 3 types of ancillary services. Namely regulation. This is essentially capacity that our load frequency control deploys on a 4-second basis to maintain balance between supply and demand and keep frequency close to the nominal value. So really, regulation is what we rely on to maintain our the balance between supply and demand between our 5-minute sched dispatch cycles. The next reserve is non-spin reserve service. This is capacity that can be started in 30 minutes, and it's typically used to cover net load forecast errors or net load ramps, and even forced outages of thermal resources. So any capacity shortfall that may show up, non-spin is the capacity that we procure to cover the risks associated with forecast errors and of course resource availability issues. The last service that we have today is called Responsive Reserve Service. This is the service that really through this service we procure a frequency responsive headroom that is available to respond when we have supply side trips, so medium to large unit trip events. That is typically when you will certainly see the responsive reserve capacity get deployed. Lastly, today ERCOT is in the process of implementing a fourth ancillary service called ERCOT Contingency Reserve Service. This is a 10-minute service, so any capability that a resource can ramp to within 10 minutes is able to provide ERCOT ECRS. And really the goal of ECRS is to help us recover frequency following unit trips and also provide additional capacity to help respond to short-term net load ramps. Short-term sustained net load ramp. So that's a very high level overview. Some folks might have seen a graphic like this shared as a part of some previous discussion. So today I have also brought this over to this task force. I have updated it, so the view that you're seeing of our ancillary service framework is from the lens of when ECRS is implemented. If you follow the protocol revision subcommittee updates that ERCOT provides, ERCOT is targeting to implement ECRS around the middle part of next year, so prior to when we enter an EMS freeze. So there is not a firm date that we've quoted yet, but the goal was to try and get it in by sometime in Q2. So this picture really is set up from the lens of how would our framework look once ECRS is in the mix. What it also is good to what it also helps communicate are the various subtypes that exist within some of these AS. So for example, responsive, there is a responsive can be provided using continuous primary frequency response, or there are two other specific response time, blocky response times we call them. So this would be fast frequency response, which gets triggered at 59.85. And the expectation is that full response is provided within 250 milliseconds. And the next one is something that load resources have been providing using a high set under frequency relay, which triggers at 59.7, and they provide a response within 30 cycles. So that's about half a second. There are two different types of resources that can provide ECRS: get dispatchable resources like generation resource, controllable load resources, so load that can follow SCED dispatch instruction is able to provide ECRS, and then also blocky load, so load that does not have a capability to follow SCED is also able to provide ECRS, and again, they may or may not have an under frequency relay. So that's probably a call out there. There are some limits also that are in place right now on some of these products. For example, if you follow our ancillary service methodology, there is a cap of 450 megawatts on the volume of PFR. So only 450 megawatts of RRS can come from FFR providing resources. There is a minimum limit on PFR, RRS PFR. Today, that number is around 1,240 megawatts. 60 and so on. So I'll that's probably that's probably a very high level summary of our product set. Now what I'll do is I'll switch and maybe give you a flavor of these services from the lens of what is the qualification criteria, who can provide it, what is the performance requirement. And I'll pause. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you, but Arushi, you have a question.
Yeah, Nitika, just on source documents. So On the volumes of how much ancillary services are being procured for each type, where are those numbers? I think for the task force, it'll be good to just to know, and if we don't know right now or you need to go back and find sources, would you let us know and maybe send that around to the group?
I can share a link. These the procurement quantities for ancillary services, we typically compute them in December for all of the following year, so for all hours in the following year, and we post them on ERCOT.com. So I can send a link, or what I might as well do is I'll update this graphic here and add a link that folks can use to get to that posting.
That would be great. And then the second one was kind of explanatory. So when you register a resource for the pig box, for example, RRS, you're registering the resource for RRS. And then as far as whether that resource will provide PFR or FFR or even UFR, those services are not additive. They are cumulative in a sense. Is that the right way to explain that? Because I've been asked that question by a few people in the task force.
You may need to help me understand that question, maybe with an example. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So since RRS PFR is the slower service and RRS FFR is the faster service, obviously one single resource isn't providing both at the exact same time. But technically a resource could provide both.
Right.
So if you have a resource that's capable of both, what is the manner in which ERCOT would qualify that resource, I'd say sequentially, for providing both services? And
so, yeah,
ensure there's no kind of double counting or kind of stacking where services are not being provided as stated.
Okay, so from a qualification perspective, we look to understand what the resource's maximum capability is. Okay, and we look to run the tests, and I think we can probably touch upon this in a couple slides when I actually do get to responsive qualification. There are independent tests, there are separate tests that we test expectations that we have when qualifying a resource to provide RRS PFR versus when they are qualifying for RRS FFR. And like I said, when you're qualifying for your max capability. So there may very well be, it's a 100 megawatt hour resource, which could have likely qualified to do 100 megawatts of RRS PFR and 100 megawatts of FFR. Now, where do the limits get applied on ensuring that we are not seeing an overlap and provision of that of response is when you engage with the market and when you submit your submit offers to provide an ancillary service and get awarded. That is when you will receive distinct awards. So you could receive, for example, I'm just going to make up numbers on that and build up on that example I started with. You could receive a 70 megawatt award for FFR and a 30 megawatt award for RRS PFR. And you are able to post FFR advancement project, that resource is able to provide both the 70 megawatts of FFR and 30 megawatts of PFR, but we expect those to be coming from distinct capacities in the resources range, essentially. And I'll pause and see if that sort of approach.
I think that's great.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I think that answered the question. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So then before I move, any further questions? All right, so then I'll move to the next slide. From here, you will really the flavor of information you will see will be from the lens of primarily from the lens of qualification, and I'll touch upon a very high level at how we measure performance, ongoing performance in real time. And I'm starting off with regulation. There is a subtype within regulation called FRRS, Fast Responding Regulation Service. So conventional regulation is typically, we expect to, the capacity that is qualified to provide the conventional regulation can be sustained for 1 hour. FRRS, however, has its own duration requirement. It's about an 8-minute service right now. When it comes to regulation can really be provided by generation resources, batteries, and load that can follow a SCED dispatch instruction, so controllable load resources. From a testing perspective, there is a coordinated test that is described in the protocols. I have quoted the section right there, but the purpose of that test is to ensure that a QSC is able to receive ERCOT's regulation dispatch instructions, and then really show us that the resource that is qualifying can respond to those regulation instructions. So this is where the resource physically moves up or down in response to a regulation instruction. For FRRS, there is an additional test. There is a capability test where we expect where we send an instruction and we want to see that the resource is able to deploy and hold to that deployment amount for about a period of 8 minutes. Lastly, there is also a self-test so that the FRRS has a 60 cycle response requirement when frequency drops below 59.91. So there's a self-test wherein we expect the resource to simulate a frequency that would trigger the autonomous deployment and measure the signals within the 1 to 2 minutes of the event, and share a very high resolution data with us. So the requirement in our protocol is that they should have a data recorder that can record at a resolution of at least 32 samples per second. So so for the purposes of qualifying, we do use that data recorder's information to validate that the resource is responding within 60 cycles. So that's the flavor of qualification requirements. From a performance perspective, really the primary metric to monitor that resources are following their set points, and I'll use the word set point. This is a combination of where SCED dispatches the resource to be and where LFC or where regulation, if the resource is carrying any, expects the resource to be. In the performance monitoring section, there are 3 different metrics depending on the resource type. So it's called generation resource energy deployment performance, which applies to resources that are registered as a generation resource, or GREDP. CLRs, or controllable load resources, have their own metric. Energy storage resources are also contemplated to have their own metric, but their portion of metric is right now gray box. So that particular NPRR, which brings that concept of measuring a storage resources performance across both its charging and discharging side, is yet to be implemented. But the concept is certainly captured in our protocols as to how we would do it. There is also analogous to how we do GREDP. There's also a base point deviation calculation, which uses similar metrics. So those would be the performance criteria really that apply to resources when they are carrying regulation. I'll probably switch over and talk about responsive now. Now, you saw a while ago, responsive does have 3 different flavors of response types, and really pretty much a broad gamut of resource sets can provide it. So generation, batteries, CLRs, and of course NCLRs can provide responsive reserve. Now, depending on the type of subset of RRS that you're providing, the qualification criteria varies. For resources that are looking to provide continuous primary frequency response, there is a frequency response or a governor test that is expected to be conducted. And this is really, we call this a self-test because you really are running this in an environment away from the grid. But that test also starts playing a role in establishing RRS limits on non-thermal resources. So we use the measurements from that test to establish what the maximum amount of RRS a resource may be able to carry. There are also coordinated telemetry tests that these resources do, and they are very fairly straightforward, wherein ERCOT sends a telemetry instruction to deploy responsive, and all we are looking to see is that the resource is able to change its responsive reserve schedule in response to the deployment instruction. Now, from a duration perspective, there are a few self-tests that I've called out here. So if you're providing PFR, the duration expectation is a 1 hour. So we want to see what the resource's 1 hour injection capability is. For FFR, the test for verifying the resource's 15-minute capability is very similar to FRRS. It is a test wherein ERCOT sends a deployment instruction and the resource responds and holds the response. But the FFR resources also have to provide a self-test wherein they demonstrate how they are able to meet the 250 millisecond requirement. So as with FRRS, FFR providing resources are also required to have that high-speed data recorder or a data recorder that measures at a resolution rate of at least 32 samples per second. And we would use those, I'll pause and I'll say those data recorded information is something we expect to use, of course, during qualification, but also if there are frequency events, we may reach out to QSCs and ask them to share their recorded data so we can verify that the resources provided response within the expected timelines. For loads, there are separate tests. There is a test wherein we send a deployment instruction and ensure that the load, this is now the NCLR, the non-controllable load resource, is able to provide that response within 10 minutes. Interestingly, there are some ongoing qualification requirements on the NCLR side. There is an annual telemetry test and a biannual relay test that they have to conduct and submit to ERCOT, and that allows them to continue to maintain their qualification for the service. From a performance perspective on RRS, really there is I have written out a few I've shared with you a few different sections, but really the one of the primary mechanisms to measure performance are during what we call as frequency measurable events. So if there is a frequency event, let's say a generation trip which results in, which is with size of around 400 plus megawatts, or which results in a delta frequency that's greater than 80 or 100 millihertz, we may call that frequency event as a measurable event. And at that point, we will go, there is a specific measurement criteria that is outlined in our nodal operating guides, attachment 8J, which specify how we will go about measuring the response of each resource that was online and had a frequency responsive headroom. So we will measure its where it was operating prior to the start of the event, where it operated when the event settled, and then of course, did it sustain its response or not? So there are two different, you call it an initial PFR response and a sustained PFR response that we'll measure to ensure that these resources have provided a response. But this measurement applies to the PFR providing resources. For FFR, the criteria is that we expect a response anywhere between 95% to 110% of the resources obligation at the time of the event. So we will, through tools that we use for measuring FME response, we will also be measuring if the FFR resources met that criteria. If there is a UFR specific event, there are similar reports that we run. The criteria from how the response is measured is also outlined in our protocols. And so that is what we follow. I'll pause for a minute. I'll see if this sort of an overview helps or if it raises any questions on RRS.
Hey, Nitika, this is Ned Bonskowski with Vista. I have one question.
Yes, Ned.
So in the materials that ERCOT presented last week, the indication was that you expect ADERs to register as controllable load resources, but it was also I also recall seeing that there might not be an expectation that they would provide primary frequency response at least within the pilot. So if you had in that scenario, would an ADER be able to provide RS as basically as a non-controllable load resource if it's not providing PFR?
So if it's probably there are others in the room who can chime in also. In my opinion, right now, I don't know that we are comfortable registering a resource as a CLR and then letting it provide a service that is dedicated for non-controllable load resources. So we may need to think through that one. My initial reaction would be, I'm hesitant, but I'll see if somebody else in the room wants to also chime in with an opinion.
Hey, Nitika, this is Dave. I can jump in on that.
Thank you.
I guess specifically as it relates to some of the discussion last week, that was really, Ned, specifically focused on phase one. And I guess as we tried to talk about as well during that meeting, in the utilization of the ALR participation model for phase one, the expectation is that folks are only going to be able to provide non-spin. So Nitika, I think some of the task force members, when we had the meeting a while back, wanted to talk about ancillary services. So obviously, Nitika is providing sort of an overview more broadly of ancillary services, but specifically as it relates to phase one and more what we presented last week, that was focused on only providing non-spin.
Okay, that's helpful. I was trying to reconcile those, but if it's in a phased approach, I think that it makes it easier to digest. Thank you both.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions for me? All right, I will move on to the next one, which is non-spin. Now, non-spin, with all of the changes that we've made, can be provided by generations, resources, batteries, controllable load resources, non-controllable load resources, and ALRs. There is, from a qualification perspective, there are two different flavors of qualifications, qualification tests that may apply in case of non-spin, depending on the status of the capacity that is used to provide. So if you're looking to provide non-spin as a offline resource using offline capacity, the test that we run is to ensure that the generation resource can ramp up within 30 minutes to its deployment amount. So synchronize and ramp up within that time. But if you're looking to provide it using as an online resource with offline power augmentation, so ducts essentially, then the test is becomes a telemetry test, wherein it's a self-test wherein we expect the resource to demonstrate that no sooner than 30 seconds before the top of the hour, they are able to change the schedule to the deployment that they were given and hold that schedule for an hour. There is also a duration test in this case as well. Today, there is an NPRR that was recently passed, which sets the duration requirement for non-spin to 4 hours. We are still working on implementing that NPRR, but really once it is, we would be as a part of qualifying a non-spin resource, verifying its ability to its state of charge that it can sustain for a 4-hour period, or a megawatt level that it will inject, which can be sustained for a 4-hour period, if you will. And we will be using that to set a qualification megawatt quantity on what is the maximum megawatt of non-spin this resource may be able to provide. From a on the NCLR side, there is also a test which is very analogous to the generation, in that once the load receives a deployment instruction, we expect the load to respond within 30 minutes. Now, on the performance monitoring side, really, some of the performance will be tied to verifying that resources that were offline came on within the 30-minute timeline that is specified, or responded within 30 minutes if it's a load. Once the resource is online, it is subject to sched dispatch, and at that point, really the metric we talked about in regulation, be it the GRED-P or the CLR EDPs, or even the ESR EDPs will apply to ensure that the resource is continuing to follow its set point. And that's at a high level what non-spin is from a qualification perspective.
Hey, Nitika, before we go to the next one, I just want to add something to it.
Yes, please.
I wanted to actually say this, and it didn't when Ned asked this question, but I guess because, again, we just kind of talked about non-spin, I guess one of the other things I wanted to be clear, I guess, Ned, your specific question was, as we think about ADERs, particularly in this first phase, how would they be participating? You mentioned being sort of a non-controllable load resource. The expectation is, again, because of using the ALR participation model for phase one, that ADERs and how it relates particularly to this slide would be something that is sched dispatched. So it really would be a CLR from the point of view of a lot of the words here. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear as well.
And Dave, this is Paul. By the way, this is Paul Waddles, consulting with Tesla. But Mark indicated last week that yes, you'll have to be sched qualified, but PFR is not going to be, at least at the outset, a requirement for a non-spin and sched qualified ADERs. We have a common understanding of that?
That is what we presented. We are kind of still thinking about that internally, I have to say. Obviously, we'll have some more discussion on that, but that is what we presented, and thinking about, again, that first phase when it would just be non-spin.
Thanks.
And sched dispatch, of course. Hey, Rishi, you have a question?
Yeah, so I think it was Sunrun's presentation earlier this week where they had a slide or a comment on a slide about the duration requirement for 4 hours. I think it was non-spin specific, or at least I thought of non-spin when I saw this slide. For the pilot, or really for resources that we contemplate would be ADERs, is there a way, Nitika, for us to think more creatively about duration? And if there isn't, could you remind me and also the group about what the implications are of a energy limited system, let's say a 2.5-hour duration system, providing non-spin? How will that look in terms of the performance obligation?
So we may need to go back and do some thinking around what flexibility we have on the duration requirement on non-spin. Like I said, we are in right now it is certainly a 1-hour product because the NPRR is yet to be implemented. But we can certainly go back and think if there is any flexibility for the pilot to have a different duration. Now, the purpose of the duration the way the duration plays out for storage resources or duration limited resources is we would want to ensure that they maintain at any time when they are providing non-spin, I'll use 4 hours as an example right now. Okay, if they are carrying non-spin in any given hour, they need to maintain a state of charge that demonstrates that that particular obligation can be sustained for a 4-hour period. So if I have a 100 megawatt hour battery, and it can carry 25 megawatts of non-spin, we would need to ensure that it retains a 100 megawatt hour state of charge during that hour. And of course, if there are deployments or if there is, it may not apply to ALRs in how it's being thought, but if there is frequency response that causes some energy depletion, we certainly discount for those in that state of charge expectation. But generally, that the spirit of it is we want to ensure that the amount of energy that is being preserved to deliver that service is deliverable for that duration.
Got it. So essentially, so just explaining it for the group then, the 5-word version of that is keep your resource with sufficient headroom or sufficient capacity space to deploy at that same bid 4 hours in a row if you are deployed for all 4 hours. Is that right?
And you're carrying non-spin in all 4 hours. So if yeah.
Got it. Okay, cool. So the second half of my question was not really a question, it was a comment to connect two things for you. I hope you're able to make the VPP experiences presentation, but just in case you weren't, and for those on the task force who couldn't. Non-spin, and Kevin Joyce described this in our presentation on Tuesday, at Tesla's presentation. Non-spin is a energy intensive service, right? And we've just covered on previous slides RRS, PFR, and regulation, which involve some discharge of energy, but essentially there's a, at least on the RRS service, it's an autonomous service, and so it's more about the device responding on the power output side based on its inverter settings, as opposed to the device holding a certain energy level for a certain period of time, and consistently doing so, and then dispatching a pretty substantial amount of its capacity. And then we were kind of trying to square that. I was trying to make this point. I'm not sure I did as well as I could, so I'll do it now. If batteries are the most sophisticated device participating as an ADER, and I'm saying that generically, not specific to any one company, and the easiest service to qualify those resources as for now is not SCED, it's RRS. What I'm trying to figure out is that even if batteries is the most sophisticated resource, will struggle to meet up with, the duration requirement, and it's just a more burdensome test to qualify for. How are we opening the door to get megawatts in quickly if we're not going to put RRS in phase 1? Like that's something I'm struggling with. Just on kind of designing, like, what is this approach? And I guess, Dave, I want to hear what you mean by phase 1 and understand that better, because it's very likely that any resource that is a battery, sure, can qualify for non-spin, but immediately by the same token will absolutely be able to demonstrate PFR and qualify for RRS. And I don't know what else is out there that could keep up with the non-spin requirements that isn't an ADER battery, and wouldn't benefit from having access to those other services sooner. So help me understand that from ERCOT's perspective, which resources, if we only limited phase 1 to non-spin, which resources will we participate, especially like what non-battery services will we actually see being demonstrated in phase 1 of the pilot?
I guess I'll start with that. I guess specifically as it relates to phase 1, the focus again for phase 1 is, because of trying to do this as quickly as possible and to get the ball rolling on a pilot program, is to use the existing participation model that we have for ALRs to the degree possible, and to do something that really doesn't require any system changes. So that is why we've been focused on that, and that being phase one. I guess in terms of technologies that we see coming, I was able to listen to most of the VPP panel or discussion earlier this week. Certainly a lot of it, I know folks are talking about, batteries and power walls and things of that nature. I don't know exactly what else is out there that folks may bring to the table as we continue to work through this. There may be other things as well, but I guess that is a lot of what I've heard so far is battery-oriented technology or battery-based technology.
Okay, so what about using the ALR model for settlement for ERCOT to essentially see performance around the resource, right? And be able to see it as zero or to see it as load. What about that prevents a resource from the battery resource, right? Because I don't know of anything else that's trying to qualify for a different service anyway, not at this time. What about providing that service is different than what Tesla has already shown ERCOT in the VPP demo earlier this year? Because if we could do the service in the demo, what about applying ALR rules for settlement prevents ERCOT from qualifying that resource as an actual resource now in the pilot? Just help me with the disconnect, because I think there is one.
Yeah. So, Arushi, you're talking about since you've already done a demo to demonstrate that at least the Tesla batteries on the distribution aggregation can provide RRS PFR. You're saying that, hey, can we incorporate that in settlements in the phase one? And I believe the answer is no, because the way we have set it up, we do require system changes. And if we need to do that, then we have to delay the start of the pilot. Right, Dave? I mean, that is the whole thing, is that we want to get this pilot off the ground quickly and use whatever we have with no system changes. And if you're talking about system changes, there will be delays.
Okay, so Sai, what are some of the system changes? I guess we keep talking about potential changes. Can you lay that out for us, like at the highest level? Like, what about? That's exactly my question. Is using basic ALR rules, right? Like the clumping approach or the offset approach, and registering like performance of the resource as load resource performance in your systems. What about that prevents the same resource from telemetry, the same way a generator does it now in an RRS event? From sending that to you? Is it that we're sending you additional telemetry and that for you to consume it's a system change?
Well, if it is a battery, I think especially if it is providing, and Nitika will kind of have to step in a little bit. If we allow ALRs to participate in the PFR market, then we will be, we'll have to think about this. I mean, I haven't really thought through this, but there is some settlement changes, because if it's an ALR type resource, they may not be set up to settle them for RRS. It's only geared for non-spin, and we may have to go back and think through that.
Yeah, we were just taking the words that are in the protocols now for ALR, and it said non-spin only. So that was the way we were going to start. I would say there has been some discussion of, not at the beginning of phase one, but maybe in some part of phase one, we let there be some kind of demonstration, an uncompensated demonstration, where, essentially you show us, here, I can do this with this resource. But again, like Dave said, our phase one was just to get us out of the gate and get started. And then maybe there could be some uncompensated demonstration that's done in phase one. And we could think about
and the other one, Arushi, I forgot. If we allow, even if the systems are capable of doing that, we need to build some metrics on how to verify this. And we don't have that right now. So, we could work towards all of that, but I'm saying it's a trade-off between when do you want to start the pilot off versus if there's any system changes and all that stuff, how long do you want to wait?
And I do
Okay,
think that's
so
going to be the.
that's helpful.
I'm sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Dave.
I guess. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was only going to add to I think part of it as well is I know we talked about the system limitations and things like that. I think one of the other key things is trying to use a lot of the rules and systems around ALR is to try and get the governing document done in the time frame that the commissioners would like. So to the degree we can forklift as much of that as possible, including even just kind of the rules around ALRs as they exist today. And obviously we talked about even some exemptions and distinction from that, and part of what Mark shared last week is to try and even get the governing document done, obviously with that goal of the October board on the 18th.
Sure. Yeah. And I would like the same thing. Well, there's no difference of opinion in when we need to get a governing document out by. What I was concerned about, and I'm going to just manifest that now vocally, is this idea of phase one in the governing document. Is it a time-bound phase or is it a capabilities-bound phase? And I think what I'm hearing, especially after Ken Ragsdale's comment, is that phase one is bound by capabilities of what we can deploy. If Tesla or Sonnet or any other entity that has batteries in an aggregation can come to ERCOT and help you figure out an easy way to provide verifiable RRS in 6 months, right? Next year, I would like for us as drafting the phase one of this pilot to not put some sort of arbitrary date on phase one that would make it impossible for us to come to you and do that work. I think that's where I want to leave it. And even without that's one point. And then the other point is even on non-spin, 4-hour duration, it won't make sense for energy limited batteries. And I mean, to be clear, like these are the primary use case for all of these resources. When I say all, I'm still only talking about batteries. I don't know also who know what other resources I'm exporting. Even for that, like we need like a clear waiver in the pilot now. Like that needs to be on our list to figure out while we write the governing document. So I would humbly request that ERCOT take that back. Nitika, if you can take leadership, or if Dave, you can take leadership on that and help us figure out the duration requirement. And I think the DER segment, since they presented on it, that will absolutely appear in their must-haves list for the governing document.
And I guess that's one thing, specifically on the time frame for phase one, if I may. I think we're actually kind of open on the length of that. And, as we've been thinking through a draft of the governing document, whether that's, we put out something like a year, I think is kind of, but I don't think that that's anything that we're a specific timeline that we're wedded to in terms of how long phase one would last. I guess as part of it as well is pretty quickly after phase one was the idea that we'd start thinking about what would the scope of phase two look like and what are some of the changes we would like to see. Obviously that probably can't happen immediately. We probably actually want to see and hear from folks a little bit about, kind of have to know a little bit about what's not working in phase one to fully, I think, scope phase two. But the idea is to start that work quickly, particularly if the idea is that phase two would potentially be some system changes and things like that we can start to put in the hopper and get queued up to make those changes.
Makes sense.
Suzanne
Okay.
Burton,
Thank you.
Suzanne Burton with TABA. Just a process question here on the governing document itself. Does it need to just address these are the requirements for phase one, or, and then are we going to, like when we get to phase two, are we going to come back with a different governing document that's here's phase two, or is the governing document supposed to address kind of how all of those will somehow work over time?
Well, the way I guess we have been approaching it is the governing document is going to be specific to phase one. Okay. And the reason we want to do that is I think the whole point is we're going to find out stuff that we don't like and we want to do differently. And, we talk about within, I think already some of the things that we want to explore under phase one as things we may want to do in a later phase. And so there'll be a little bit more onus in the sense that at some point we'll have to go back and get another governing document and have it approved by the ERCOT board. That being said, I think having one that's really focused on phase one, while it will mean we'll have to go back to the board and then eventually, is the best way, I think, to get something done in the timeframe people would like to see something done.
Okay.
Hey, Dave, this is Will McAdams. Can I jump in here?
Please do, yeah.
Okay. Look, and I know Jimmy's on the call because I heard his voice and he almost jumped in as well. But the intent of the memo was, again, to launch the pilot under conservative parameters that, again, get it launched in a timely way. My advocacy to the ERCOT board was that we would approach this in an iterative approach. Again, in order to set the parameters for the governing document, by October or at the latest, in our vision, by the December board of directors meeting, it needed to be fairly restrictive. And again, given the operational experience of the next year, it could be modified. And I don't think this commission is going to change that dynamically, and the ERCOT board certainly isn't going to change that dynamically on its makeup, composition, and policy goals to where uncertainty is introduced for the stakeholders' purposes in participating in the pilot. So we don't need to get wrapped around the axle on other ancillaries being moved out of qualification at this phase. But you guys just need to put together a black and white example of what your must-haves are for the purposes of launching this thing. And that's, I know, what I expect, and I believe that's what Commissioner Glodfelty expects, and I believe that's what the rest of the commission will follow suit on. Jimmy, you jump in here if you have any other thoughts.
Will, I'm glad you spoke up. I was going to say something earlier. There's a reason that we're doing this pilot to help solve problems longer term. We need to know if there are limitations on ERCOT's technical platforms, but we need to be open to all solutions. What I'm getting a little bit frustrated about, not in this, but across the board, is every modification we want to make to the market, ERCOT is saying, well, we've got a technical problem. We're going to have a change of a system. We've got to have this. We got to have that. And I know that's all part of it, but it cannot stop progress. So we have to, in phase one, we have to get as much as we possibly can and be open to maybe different ways of doing things, modifications or exemptions from protocols, until we can figure out what the best structure is for this as we have the new EMS system coming online. And I would just encourage people to take that view, which is this is not 80,000 megawatts of changes. This is under 100 megawatts of changes. And that's very much a rounding error when it comes to the system. And we can technically find the solutions, and we should. And those should be reflected in the governing documents and then the process by which we have going forward to solve problems. That's my view.
This is Paul, consulting with Tesla again, just real quickly. Wondering if, obviously this is going to have to be an iterative process, like Commissioner McAdams said. Seems like going back to the board every time and getting the governing document amended might be a little, I'm just wondering if there's room within the rule and within the task force procedures to have sort of an appendix approach to the governing document where maybe just the task force or maybe the commissioners together or something like that could bless phase 1B and phase 2, phase 3, just throwing that out and thinking out loud, but rather than have to tee this up with the board every time we want to make a minor change to the governing document or major. So,
I was thinking the same thing, actually, so appreciate you bringing that up.
great minds.
Yes, absolutely.
think we can
Me
talk
too.
about-
And the reason, yeah, well, we can talk more about that as a task force, but there's going to be a lot of things that are iterative. And that was why I said that phases are not time-bound phases. They are functional phases, like based on capacities. ERCOT's phase 1 could be 4 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 months, it could be 2 weeks. The point, I think, the nice way to do this, respecting the kind of the structure that ERCOT needs, would still be to have a governing document with technical appendices that address the natural kind of fallout of being limited to the ALR construct, not just for now, but for a while. It may be a while before ERCOT can actually see these exports as exports in the system. So I think, Dave, we can work together as a task force with ERCOT to come up with something flexible and not have to have the ERCOT board repeatedly approve small changes. And we can talk about that more.
So just,
Well, then this is Will McAdams again. Let me just leave you with one final thought. Folks, in everything that I've had to experience over the last year and a half, I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good on this. And I think Commissioner Glotfelty feels the same way, and I'm pretty sure I can get 5 votes on the commission for that. So I urge you to come together, but don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
So I think we have a couple of to-do items to talk through that when we next get together to discuss the governing document. So I think how to build in that flexibility appropriately and scope out when we would need to go back to the ERCOT board. I think we'll put that on our to-do list to have a discussion about.
And I guess, I certainly get the desire to have something sort of flexible, and I guess the intent of having a process where we might have to go back to the board for approval of the governing document is not, to be clear, is not any sort of intent to slow it down. I mean, the whole hope of that is to avoid us needing to try and make decisions about future iterations as part of getting something approved as quickly as we can and get something rolling. So that was really the intent of thinking about that way, is to not have to worry about future iterations at this particular point.
Now, I would also note, we also thought of the idea of trying to keep the governing document as kind of major and high level, get that approved, and maybe there is some other sub-document that can be reviewed and changed and approved in a quicker fashion. I don't know if we've figured out how to do that, and actually maybe some help from you guys to help us do that.
Yep. I think we can speak to that next Friday's meeting. That would be a subject we can add to the agenda. So just from a time check perspective, I know Nitika has one more page. Maybe if you want to cover that one really quickly, and we can see what remaining questions we have on today's topic.
That sounds fair. I mean, really the flavor of information is the same. This is our contemplated information for ECRS. So I'm not going to belabor I'm not going to take too much time on this. Like with non-spin, there is a 2-hour duration requirement that we are contemplating on ECRS when it is here. All resources that are qualified to participate in SCED are automatically qualified to provide ECRS. So that is possibly one less test, but there is some test we are thinking we may need to see some telemetry checks and some information that we may need to understand what is the max range of a response a resource can provide in 10 minutes. So that's probably the only difference or only thing that I would call out at this point as being interesting about ECRS from a qualification perspective. The performance criteria is also really just ensuring that the resource followed its base point. So GRED-P, CLR-EDP, and ESR-EDP would apply. And that's really my last slide.
Thanks for walking us through that. Any final questions for ERCOT on this topic? I appreciate everybody pulling together their presentations for the 5 workshops we've done in the last 2 weeks on relatively short notice, sometimes no notice. So I appreciate you continuing to make sure that the task force members and everyone else involved continues to increase our education on certain topics. I think it's all of these workshops have caused good questions in the workshops, and I know it caused a lot of good discussions outside of the workshops as people with various levels of understanding of different parts of the whole here try to come together, culminating in a governing document that we can get off go and get going with the pilot. So I appreciate everybody's heavy lift so far, but we still have a lot of work to do, as you know. I know the market segments have been working on their must-haves for the governing document, and also creating a lot of parking lot issues for us to pick up once we get the governing document behind us and continue barreling towards the start of this pilot. So I encourage the market segments to continue that work. Just a reminder for the public tuning in, our next public meeting of the task force is on the afternoon of Monday the 12th, so 2 Mondays from now. We'll have another official meeting, and at that meeting we'll be able to report out kind of where we stand with majority consensus on items for the governing document, and where there may need to be more work to do on things that we don't yet have a majority consensus on. So look forward to that discussion. Is there anything else for the good of the cause before we tune out?
Just a quick question. This is Paul again. So according to the rule, ERCOT owns the governing document. I mean, that's your responsibility for drafting it, but will we have a draft to start reviewing on the 12th? Are we that far along yet, or I'm just curious?
So we have a good draft going. I can't promise anything. The hope is that we obviously want to bring it to the task force. The hope is to do that maybe even next Friday. I don't know that that's going to be possible, but that's something that we are trying to get to, where that we can actually maybe spend some of the time maybe walking through it. But that people would start seeing it by the time we met again for the afternoon at the 12th.
All right. Thank you all. I hope you have a good, safe Labor Day weekend. And Arusha, you had something? Yep.
Yeah. I was just going to say, before we all meet on September 9th, to the extent any of the task force segments have a list of potential must-haves, or one where you like to review them with us, with Jason and I, we can try to do some kind of early office hours or some like small discussions with specific segments to help you all think through structurally where some of those must-haves will fit. I've gotten a lot of asks to help understand whether some of the must-haves belong in the body of the governing document, or they belong in the quarterly reports, or maybe they belong in something else like a utility aggregator agreement or whatnot. So if you need help with any Venn diagramming, just so we can kind of get towards September 9 with a confident sense of where everything falls, anytime, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, just send me an email, and if Jason's available, I can loop him in too. We're happy to do one-offs and chat with any of the members about just getting to that list for Friday.
Yep, thank you. I know that we'll have a number of other things we need to tackle, things like what goes into an agreement. There will be more workshops scheduled. A number of folks have reached out to me on potential topics that they'd like us to cover, but I think that we're going to spend our next couple of weeks focused on the governing document. That's our first waypoint. Lots of other stuff sitting in our parking lot that we need to circle around to, and I suspect we'll have another series of workshops in the October-November timeframe. So thanks for the suggestions. Keep sending me your suggestions on further workshops that we need to do before we get off the go mark on the pilot, and we'll get those scheduled. So with that, please have a good holiday weekend. We'll see you next week.